So I'd like to join my colleagues Isabel and Anke in welcoming everyone. It's so wonderful to see this room full of colleagues, many of whom I've missed for a while and I haven't seen in a while. So thank you so much for coming. I have the great honor and pleasure indeed to introduce Dr. Terry Osborn. Dr. Osborn is a professor of education at the University of South Florida. He taught, and that's interesting for many of us here to know, secondary German for 6 years in Georgia and Florida prior to entering higher education. He has also served twice as interim chancellor and vice chancellor of academics and student affairs at the University of South Florida, Sarasota-Manatee campus, and he was previously Dean of the College of Education and held administrative roles on the faculties of Fordham University, Queen's University of New York, and wait for it, the University of Connecticut. We hope being here at UConn feels a little bit like coming home. Dr. Osborn is an academic authority in applied linguistics and critical pedagogy. He has published numerous books, articles, and chapters in the areas of foreign and world language education, interdisciplinary education, and critical pedagogy. I am not alone in my opinion that his 2006 book, Teaching World Languages for Social Justice, a source book of principles and practices, is a sine qua non for language educators. Unsurprisingly, Dr. Osborn's research has received a number of awards, including the American Educational Studies Association's Critics' Choice Award for his book, Critical Reflection on the Foreign Language Classroom, which just appeared in its 20th anniversary edition. He was also awarded the Stephen Freeman Award by the Northeast Conference on the Teaching of Foreign Languages for his best published article on foreign language teaching techniques. His current book projects include World Language Education as Critical Pedagogy, The Promise of Social Justice, together with Dr. Timothy Reagan, which is in press with Routledge, and the book World Language Education and Critical Awareness, which is under contract with Information Age Publishing. Terry, thank you so much again for joining us. I know we're all in for a treat.
Thank you, Manuel. I appreciate it. And thank you all for inviting me to be a part of this. I have a paper here that I'm thinking through as I'm discussing it, and I've decided to go off script, which is always a bit of a dangerous thing. But Irvin, I thought your work was really interesting, and there were some connections that I think I want to bring out in this conversation. So about 20 years ago, I began looking at what I had experienced as a foreign language student. To give you a little bit of history, I took German in high school, sort of fell into it because a friend of mine was taking it. And so, all right, I'll take it too. Then went on to get my bachelor's and master's degree in German. It struck me as I was learning about the German education programs in the United States that we had a significant history of not producing speakers of German at the end of 2 years or 3 years or 4 years at the high school level particularly. Remember that I'm in teacher education primarily. And I was in Istanbul at the time working on a language for special purposes project. And I sat down and it just sort of hit me after having been freed up from a lot of the things that we used to do in the 80s and 90s, that if you were to try and design a program of study that were less likely to produce speakers of a particular language, you'd be hard pressed to do so in the United States setting. So I began to think, all right, well, so then what does that mean? What does it mean if we are not producing, and there's a lot of argumentation I can give you as to why that is the case. But what does it mean is going on in the classroom? Because you can't be sitting there for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years and not learn anything. So something's going on in that classroom. And what I began to look at was, during that time we were moving, the conversations had begun years before, but we were moving from the term foreign language, and we were debating a number of other terms like world language, second languages, and so forth. And we've sort of settled in on world language education, which is fine. There's critiques of that as well. But I began to look at, is it possible to integrate the idea of a critical pedagogy of foreign language education into the elementary and intermediate levels. And in particularly, if the term foreign isn't really the issue, but the concept of foreignness in the classroom is the issue that we need to be putting under examination. And so that's the work that I began at that point. A number of other colleagues worked with me on that, including Manuela. And then we began to look at, okay, so if that's the case, then what are we going to do differently in language education? Again, particularly at these early levels. And so when I'm looking at this project, which you are undertaking now, and it talks about, I'm going to read some of it, the goal to decenter whiteness in language education by developing curricula that truly reflect the diversity and cultural variety of modern day societies and help uncover the oppression that minoritized students often suffer and that dominant groups perpetuate. It really takes me back into that same set of challenges. And that is that we have to begin to take a look at the ideology that we are using, the mental frameworks, if you will, that we are using to organize the work that we are doing in language education. So moving this forward now to talk about decolonization and whiteness, in 2007, I believe it was, Sweeting and Vickers, in a conversation about Hong Kong, pointed to the impact of colonization on language in education. And they said it often involves, quote, some variant of neo-Marxist determinism, in the light of which colonial education policies are seen as part of efforts by the, quote, Western, unquote, capitalist metropolis to impose and perpetuate imperial control and to extend it beyond the end of formal colonial rule. From this perspective, any trace of, quote, Western, unquote, influence on schools or their curricula tends to be interpreted as evidence of cultural imperialism, with all the negative overtones that term implies. This is a very similar criticism to what was levied against critical pedagogy in the late 90s, which was that it was a great form of critique, but in terms of prescribing any steps forward, it fell short. And so one of the pieces that Manuela was referencing in 2006 that I wrote was Teaching World Languages for Social Justice. So the concept is this: if we're teaching languages in a way that is focusing on foreignness, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, is there a different way to structure what we're doing in language education so that it is pursuing a completely different goal or completely different end? And that was the purpose of that text, was to go back in and say, is there a different way to approach this? And if so, what might that way look like? It was not, and I said it several times in the work, it was not to prescribe a new approach. That, in fact, I think is the problem that a lot of this work can run into as well. So let's back up and think about the concept of whiteness for a minute. Peter McLaren wrote about this many years ago, and one of the things that he talked about was that it basically becomes a way in which forms of non-whiteness are defined. So it essentially sets up the category of whiteness, but rather than populating it with specific things, it will it basically defines non-whiteness as being somehow deviant from norm. Okay, the question then becomes, where do we see this kind of work in a language classroom? And what I'm going to argue is that it's not merely deterministic. It's not just that we go in the classroom and there's this process by which you're taught this equals foreign, therefore you accept it, and therefore we move forward with this idea of what foreign. A lot of cultural struggle that's happening in that classroom, both within and among the students and the teacher as we walk through these things. So I'm going to very briefly back up and talk about what this sort of foreignness took the form of. When I was in high school and teaching German, the metaphor around which the texts were built were something like our friends, or going overseas to meet people and learning skills that you would need if you went overseas to meet people. German largely that way. There's nothing inherent in that process that kept me from learning it. But it's an interesting choice, because what we've chosen then is to assume that the purpose of language and language education at the time was to prepare people to go overseas and to engage in activities that were largely either information gathering or commercial, capitalistic, if you will, in the way in which we are interacting with one another. So what happened then is the idea of a world language became a form of exotica. It became something that was unique and novel. And the idea that language diversity existed in the United States was really one book that attempted, well, I thought was going to attempt to deal with this issue by talking about an exchange student in Texas who happened to speak Spanish, was from Spain, I believe it was from Spain. In any event, the argument could very well have been made, well, why isn't it a heritage language speaker that we were engaging with in a Texas school? Certainly that's no less realistic. And the latest numbers I've seen in terms of the number of people who go overseas after completing language study is somewhere in the single-digit percentage-wise. It's not a very common thing that happens. Okay, so according to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, racism is perpetuated by deeming whiteness as superior and other racial and ethnic groups as inferior. The prevalence of white dominant culture and racism leads to an internalized racial superiority for those who adhere to it. This internalized dominance, quote, describes the experience and attitudes of those who are members of the dominant, privileged, or powerful identity groups. Members of the dominant group accept their group's socially superior status as normal and deserved. When people of a non-dominant group, for example, people of color, are discriminated against, targeted, or oppressed over time, they often believe the myths and misinformation about their group. Known as internalized racism, it happens when an oppressed group believes that the racial views that society communicates are true, and they act as if they were true. Now, I'm going to argue that the same is true in language education when we begin to construct the identity of those of whom we are studying, if I may, in ways that will begin to reinforce the again, quotes here, deviant nature of the non-English speaker in the United States. And there are specific ways in which we've seen this done in language classrooms. One of the ways I want to talk about is geographic fragmentation. Now, I took a look at this a couple of years back just to see if this was still going on. And thankfully, it's not the same. There's a little less of it, but it is still going on. And that's when you take the nation of the United States specifically, and you carve it up into areas where there is language diversity and areas where there is not language diversity. But when you compare it to the way in which the rest of the world is depicted in these maps and so forth at the front of the textbooks often, or at the back of the textbooks, there is no analogous carving up of any other nation state or any other area in which this language is spoken. So Spanish is a good example. You'll see maybe on a map, it's highlighting Florida, it's highlighting Texas, it's highlighting Arizona or Southern California. But when you go back and see other areas of the world, there are no such holes carved out of those for other, perhaps indigenous language groups. They're just not, it's not done. And so what it does is it fragments the United States in such a way that, just go through an implication here, if I am in Iowa and I speak Spanish as a native language, am I a member of the Spanish-speaking world or not? I'm not going to resolve that for you. It's a question that we're going to sit out there and let sort of walk through our mind as we are going to look at some of these. Another example is often the economic trajectories. Now, this one has really decreased, but the idea that there are certain job expectations in the United States of people who speak non-English languages as native languages. These are often found in curriculum guides or in arguments that will often be used for language study as well. And then the other one I want to talk about is the idea of English and American, the the category of American and the language of English as being synonymous, because there is a lot of this that still goes on in terms of language study that we need to be very aware of, because what we're saying essentially is, I'll give you one example. I remember reading in a text, Hispanic names are of course different than American names. Now this was tied to an activity where you were to go through the phone book and find essentially Hispanic sounding names, and then you were to recognize that these were different somehow. But again, you've set up categories where an Hispanic name can't be American in somehow. And so what you end up doing is you create the sense of foreignness in the curricula as you begin to equate what it means to be American and what it means to be an English language speaker. Okay. So then I wanted to look at what are the alternative approaches that are available. Is there another way to think about doing language study if we're not going to do it sort of this piece overseas? Now, I told you I was a German teacher. I taught German in Northwest Georgia, I would say about 50 miles from Chattanooga, Tennessee, which doesn't sound very interesting, except that just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, there was a place called Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, which I knew as a place where there was a Civil War battlefield. And so, you know, when you drove through there, it was essentially the battlefield. What I didn't know is that there, surprisingly, used to be a fort there called Fort Oglethorpe. What I didn't know as a German teacher was that in World War I and/or II, Fort Oglethorpe was the site where all the German resident aliens were interned when the war was in play east of the Mississippi River. So here I was 40 to 50 minutes from a place which had a significant history for German speakers in the United States that I was completely unaware of as a language teacher. That could have been used, I thought of years later, as a way of exploring the issues of language and discrimination and so forth in the United States, which up until that point had not been, was not being explored in the level that it could have been explored. So I began to take a look at, all right, so what is this process then of rethinking the way we teach elementary and intermediate language in such a way that we're focusing on building a curriculum of social justice? And I'm gonna walk through very briefly here some of the pieces of what that would look like. The first, and I think the most important in a lot of ways, is that we have to resist positive aspects of teaching, positivistic aspects of teaching. Now, what does that mean? The concept of positivism grows out of the scientific and philosophical literature, but it's essentially that there is an absolute truth, and that truth is unchanging, and it's divisible and measurable, and once we understand all the pieces of it, we put together a whole. And what we often have done in language education is that we have treated language as something that is meaningfully separate from those who use that language. Now, let me explain. In other words, we talk about grammar and vocabulary and all these things as though they exist out there somewhere. And what we are doing is bringing students over to that hill to study it. Instead, we need to be thinking of language as a constantly changing phenomenon. I'm in Florida, and one of the ways I often teach this to my students is I say, so if I get out a map and I ask you, where is the beach? You're going to point to the outline of Florida, right? And it looks like it's fixed, and it looks like that's where the beach is. But if we go out to the beach, where all of a sudden it becomes water and sand, and that line is constant, there is always change going on. The thing. And so it is with languages. And so one of the things we have to do is that we have to recognize not only the nature of languages, but also the nature of language learning is not something that is a single entity in terms of the way you approach it. The way in which we teach languages in Florida, and the way that you teach languages in Storrs, Connecticut, and the way in which we teach languages elsewhere should be different. That doesn't mean that the language itself necessarily changes, but the context in which we are teaching is different, and therefore the way in which we approach it is different. Another issue that came up in some of this research, pardon me, just 1 minute for some water here, was that there are a number of connections between elements of faith communities and social justice. And one of the ways in which this became apparent to me, I taught at Fordham University, which is a Jesuit institution in New York City, and they have a very high concern about social justice in the work that they do. One of the more interesting ones for me, though, was Calvin College, which is in Michigan. And they've done some work out there where they are looking at the fact that in elementary and intermediate language courses, when you think about the kind of vocabulary we are given and the kind of depictions we have of language speakers, they never face moral dilemmas. Think about that. They don't face moral dilemmas. They don't deal with emotional issues. They don't, significant emotional issues. They don't deal with disabilities. They don't, I mean, now we're seeing more of that than we did. But the point being, there's a lot of the human experience that's being left out of what we find in most elementary and intermediate language classrooms. And so the idea of bringing these kinds of conversations into the classroom, moral dilemmas and so forth, is a part of teaching world languages for social justice. You can't do it as a blurb at the end of the chapter. It has to be part and parcel of the way in which you think about doing language education. It begins with a teacher who is concerned about social justice and holds a belief in the student's humanity. So there is a recognition of respect for the students and a recognition of the importance of social justice. Again, if there is not a value commitment on part of the instructor who's wanting to do this, then it's going to be at best simply, well, it's going to probably be a disaster, but at the very least, it's just going to be a show. It's not going to be really transformative in any form or fashion. The next, it's not the end of the educational experience. It's not the goal of the educational experience. It's the beginning of the educational experience, and the end of it is lifelong. If you begin to teach in this way, if we have teachers who are concerned about social justice in the language classroom, it doesn't stop when you finish German 2 or 3 or 4. It continues on as a way of life for those who are invested in it. Another one is that it's certainly not linear, it's recursive. You're not going to be marching from point A in a social justice curriculum to point Z in a social justice curriculum. Things are going to come up, you're going to have to reverse back on it, you're going to have to go back and retreat it and so forth. This is important because this came up, I think, in some of what Irvin was saying as well. Teaching world languages for social justice involves inquiry with, and that with is important, with others in our community, or with other, and community can be defined in a various lens. It's not inquiry on somebody. You're not looking at them like they're under a microscope. You're actually inquiring with them about understanding what are the structures, the foreignness or the oppressive structures that we begin to see in our society, so that we begin to become aware of what's going on in that way. It can certainly focus on problems and be part of problem posing. If you're familiar with the Highlander School in Monteagle, Tennessee, it was headed by a guy named Miles Horton, who did a lot of the training of civil rights leaders in the 60s. And one of the things that he was insistent upon was that you connect it to broader social movements. That's important as well, because what we're doing in language education cannot be separated out from what's going on in the society around us as some sort of novelty. We want to connect it to what's going on in the society around us, and in ways that relate to what we do in language and what we can learn in language as well. It does not elevate action above listening. Listening is hugely important. It is in itself a form of activism. This is important because language education is we start getting very prescriptive, and we start saying, here's what it is you need to learn, here's what it is, these are the 10 things you need to know in order to build a critical pedagogy of world language education, or to teach languages for social justice. And it's all about activity, and you're moving so fast, you're not listening to what's going on in the community around you. And that's a very, very important piece of it. And finally, it's not conforming, it's confrontational. Years ago, I remember getting back an article I had sent into some journal, I forgot where it was now, and was talking about some of these sort of ways of challenging language education. And they wrote back, one of the comments was, language educators like their innovation in measured amounts, which I thought was a really nice way of saying we don't like change. But what could be a confrontational element to the work that we're doing? There's no way there won't be. And you just have to get comfortable with the fact that if you're going to teach languages in a way that is designed to challenge and make a difference in the ways that we're talking about, it simply is going to be confrontational, and you're going to have to decide in what ways you're comfortable with that and what ways you're not. Okay, so as we begin to move this out, reinforcing whiteness or foreignness in the language classroom, over the last 20 years, there's a couple of things that I've noticed that I'm concerned about and would like to bring to your attention, because I've seen this now begin to develop. One is that there's an appropriation of the term that has happened. So world language teaching for social justice has become something that people believe perhaps and claim that they're doing, but when you begin to actually take a look at what they're describing that they do, it isn't this. Tokenization, perhaps some form of awareness building or something along those lines, but it's certainly not transformative in the approach. The second thing is that I've noticed very little progress, unfortunately, with increasing critical language awareness, and I'll talk a second about that, critical language awareness in the language classrooms at the elementary and intermediate level. In other words, we're stuck in a dilemma, and this is it. Are we going to teach language, or are we going to teach about languages? And my argument is you're going to teach both. You have to teach both. In the way that we approach language education, a piece of what we have to do is help students understand how language functions. And particularly in the US society, it functions as an acceptable, quote unquote, surrogate for other forms of discrimination. So there are types of discrimination I could not get away with, nor would I want to, could not get away with in American society, US society. But if you remove the ethnicity, race, religion, language variety, it's not only considered acceptable, in some ways it's considered entertainment. As a person who grew up in the South, I can give examples out of Southern dialect where it is perfectly common to see someone equate Southern dialect with things like incest and being backwards in terms of technology or something along those lines. And if you tried that with any other marker of identity, if you did that with any other marker of identity in the US, you would be met with understandably, much more of a backlash for it, of a redress for it. I'm going to argue that the same should be true in terms of language, because what's happening is we will again see language used as a surrogate for other forms of discrimination, as a more acceptable, if you will, form. Into a list of how-tos. And so it becomes, and I know we all have to teach on Monday mornings, and it's nice to have a list of here's what I'm going to do. But what happens when you do that is you lose sight of the fact that this is a way of life. It's a way of teaching. It's an understanding and organizing principle for what you see pedagogy as. And so there's a lot of increase of activities and ways in which you can do this. And those are fine. I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't have those. Of the enterprise of teaching world languages for social justice are going to fall far short. And I want to give you a sobering thought. I had a doctoral student at Fordham who did some work in approaching the language class that she was doing in a local high school as in terms of critical pedagogy, social justice. They did wonderful activities. Her description, the students loved them. They were so engaged. They had their eyes open to all these things that were happening around them. And she went back 3 months later and talked to them about it. To a person, very few remembered anything that they had gained in terms of an awareness during that time frame 3 months before. They remembered, oh yeah, we did something cool. That was essentially the memory of it. So the reason I bring that sobering thought up is because this is a long-term, multi-generational project. It is not just something that's gonna be, me and the group of scholars that I've been working with on this. This is going to take sustained effort over time to rethink the way in which we do language education. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions or duck any criticisms.